There are many different things in this bill, but they're all aimed at making energy more affordable and driving pollution out of the system.
Hello, and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Juliet Eilperin, Deputy Climate and Environment Editor here at the Washington Post. Today, we'll have two segments about how the U.S. government is investing in climate change solutions. My first guest is Democratic Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico. He's a member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Senator Heinrich, welcome to Washington Post Live.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Excellent. Let's get started. So why don't we start with the recent COP27 climate conference, UN climate conference in Egypt, where nearly 200 countries agreed to help pay poor and more vulnerable nations for the damage caused by climate change, which is also known as a loss and damage. Do you support that initiative that was adopted at the COP conference in Egypt?
Yeah, I do. I think it's really important because it really gets everyone in the tent, because it's going to take a real unified effort to address this globally. And, you know, I think the fact that you now have stronger support because of that from a number of countries that are really feeling the direct impact of this on their populace and on their economies right now, coupled with real leadership in the United States for the first time in a number of years, it really gives us the momentum to begin to deal with this on a global scale.
Now, earlier this year, U.S. Special Climate Envoy John Kerry indicated that the payments to address loss and damage would cost trillions of dollars. Do you think that, that's an accurate assessment of what we're talking about in terms of what more industrialized countries will be paying? And what do you think in terms of, American support for such an initiative, given the fact that there's been some resistance to spending money to help vulnerable countries overseas in the past?
I think, I don't know what the precise scale is going to be, but the principle is important because we're going to see incidents like what we saw recently in Pakistan, rising sea levels for many, many nations in the Pacific. And I think the lesson here is we're all in this together, and the United States should be a world leader. We have always been a world leader, and we should continue to do that.
Now, even though the nations at the UN conference agreed to obviously establish this new fund, they failed to take more ambitious action to curb greenhouse gas emissions. And every indication from the most recent updates in terms of nations' commitments is we're still on track for catastrophic warming and will overshoot the agreed upon global climate goal. And so I'm wondering what you think about that as potentially a missed opportunity and why it was so hard and continues to be so hard to mobilize countries across the world to commit to greater greenhouse gas emissions reductions at a time where there's broad agreement among these countries that we are headed into dangerous territory when it comes to global warming.
Well, I think that the science is very real, but I think the way that humans adapt to change is very nonlinear. And so I think the way that we can accelerate the global change is to actually lead here at home. And it's really important to realize that what we've done this year with the Inflation Reduction Act is probably much bigger than we even realized at the time. The CBO estimates for how much impact that would have on our economy, how much it would drive electric prices down. The analysis that's being done since then suggests that they really underappreciated the scale of the incentives in that legislation. And if we create the cheapest power on the planet right here in the United States, Credit Suisse is suggesting that might be 0.5 cents per kilowatt hour or $5 per megawatt hour. Everyone on the planet is going to want to do the same thing. So by leading domestically, we create a path for much faster change internationally.
I'm glad you brought up the Inflation Reduction Act, since that's our next set of questions that I wanted to ask you. So along those lines, we're going to talk about some of the long-term implications of this bill, which obviously was predominantly dominated with its climate provisions. But in terms of the immediate effects you've seen of this legislation since it passed in August, can you give us a sense of how you think it's already reverberating, whether that's in the private sector, in the government, or elsewhere?
Well, I think you see it in the private sector. If you follow the trade publications, we've seen battery factory after battery factory announcements, solar announcements for manufacturing. And I think one of the things that's really important to realize about the Inflation Reduction Act is it is substantial industrial policy. It doesn't put a thumb on the scale for this technology or that technology so much, but it does create incentives across the board to drive pollution out of the economy. And I think the scale of what we've done, because those incentives are for the most part uncapped incentives, we will see an enormous change in our economy. We'll see the benefits of that in real jobs, in manufacturing jobs, in installation jobs, and you'll see power, primarily electricity, at levels of cost that we've never really seen before. Literally, the analysis that we're seeing suggests that it will be the cheapest power on the planet. And I think, that is something that was underappreciated at the time.
So just following up on that specific point, and analysts at the time projected that this bill alone would not achieve the reductions that President Biden has committed to, which is that the U.S. would reduce its greenhouse gas emissions at least in half compared to 2005 levels by the end of the decade. And I'm wondering what you think of that. Do you think that these kinds of analyses need to be updated? Are you satisfied with the kind of climate impact we will get from this bill? Or do you see further action that would be needed to really meet the U.S.'s goal on that front?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that we're facing a catastrophic future, and the faster we act, the more we mitigate that. So yes, I do believe we can do more and that we should do more. But I also think we're learning that this legislation actually has a substantially bigger impact than we may have appreciated at the time. There was a recent Credit Suisse report that suggests that the total spend, private plus public, as a result of the incentives in this legislation, could be $1.7 trillion. That means we're going to see more change in our economy and more action on climate and decarbonization in the next 4 years than we've seen in the previous 40. So I do think it's time to really take a victory lap on what we've accomplished, and at the same time recognize that we're going to have to do many other things as well. There were things in this legislation that we were not successful at including. For example, incentives on transmission that were very important to me didn't end up in the bill. But we shouldn't also kick ourselves for passing what is the most effective on a global scale climate investment in world history.
And one component in the IRA that you helped secure is a rebate for electric appliances. Could you talk about how that program works, given that there are plenty of people in our audience who probably are looking into it and see it as one of the most direct impacts in their lives that they might experience as a result of that bill being passed?
Absolutely. So there's about $9 billion of funding for direct electrification of home appliances. Everything from upgrading your service panels so that you can deal with higher loads that may come with a electric vehicle, or additional electrification that replaces gas-fired thermal heating in your house, hot water, those kinds of things, to direct rebates for a new induction stove or a new heat pump water heater. All of these things give people the tools to be able to actually take action on climate change in their own lives. I've been doing this to my house over the last couple of years, and it's really rewarding to realize that you are making a meaningful difference, and at the same time you're taking sort of long-term charge of your energy costs. The combination of solar plus induction cooking, plus heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, really give you some of the most efficient tools to have a comfortable home, and at the same time take a really meaningful action on climate change, driving out the greenhouse gases that live in every one of our homes and businesses.
So you're right. There is an eagerness on the part of some Americans to take advantage of it. And we have a question from our audience, Julie Mark in Illinois, that I wanted to share with you and see if you could respond. She asked, how can we expedite the climate parts of the IRA that will help homeowners and consumers? I recently bought a home with gas appliances that I need to replace immediately. I can't use the rebates in the IRA as the Biden administration guidance on monies to states is too slow. So it looks like I won't get the rebates that I should be eligible for. And millions of homeowners should be buying those electric appliances now too. What would you say to someone like Julie?
Well, one of the things I would say to her is look at January as a date when you can access some of those incentives immediately on the tax side. So if you're buying a new heat pump water heater or a new heat pump replacing an old gas-fired furnace, those tax rebates become live next calendar year. In addition, we're working with states, and particularly I'm working with my home state of New Mexico, to speed up that process of getting those rebates available to people at the retail sector so that they can make the best possible decision about their future at the point of sale.
And the legislation also earmarked billions of dollars to create a U.S. supply chain for electric vehicles. Could you talk about what that means for the average American?
One of the things that I've learned, I was part of a college team that built an electric vehicle, solar powered vehicle in the early 1990s, 1992, 93. We raced from Dallas to Minneapolis, and we learned a lot from that process that we see in cars today. One of the things that I've learned with, I'm now on my second plug-in vehicle, is how much cheaper it is to run a car off of electricity as opposed to off of a internal combustion engine. It's on the scale of a third of the cost on upfront energy, and then you have almost none of the maintenance costs, changing the oil and tune-ups and the things that typically come with internal combustion engines. So when you create these incentives for people, what you really do is help levelize the upfront costs, and then they see the economic benefits for years down the road. One of the things we don't want to do is be dependent on hostile nations for the supply chain for these things. So doing actual industrial policy, bringing that supply chain home to the United States really gives us control over our own destiny. And we are already seeing the scale of battery announcements, both lithium ion, which is what we're going to see, especially in the auto sector, as well as for things like consumer electronics, but also new technologies for the United States that are really going to help us control our own destiny.
Okay, I do want to ask about the path ahead of Congress, but but before that, what kind of car did you and your college friends create, and what happened to it after you drove it to Dallas?
So it was a carbon fiber solar car that was flat on top. It looked like a big upside down wing. But the materials technology that we used, like carbon fiber, things like regenerative braking, which were not in the auto industry at the time, migrated to the Prius and is now common on every plug-in vehicle in the United States. LED lights, which weren't really used in the auto industry at the time, all of those things migrated from these races of college solar cars to the actual auto industry. And now, of course, we're seeing the actual electrification of the auto fleet. And we've seen that in some countries, adoption rates, dramatically higher than what we've seen in the US so far. We're early on that change, but it's a non-linear change. And when you hit about 6%, it tends to trend towards infinity.
Excellent. Okay, so now looking ahead, obviously what we've been talking about in the past was achieved with solely Democratic support. And now that Republicans will control the House majority, what do you see in terms of a divided Congress shaping the path forward on climate policy?
One of the things we have to do, even in a divided Congress, is the appropriations process. And that continues to be an opportunity to drive additional carbon out of the economy. So that's someplace I'll be looking to have an impact. I also think we have opportunities for things, and the moment might not be right now, but to look at permitting that doesn't lower the bar on environmental quality, but does get to yes on something like a transmission project, yes or no for that matter, a whole lot faster.
Got it. And now moving to the international stage, President Biden and China's Xi Jinping recently met and agreed to collaborate once again on climate policy, which obviously is significant given that China and the United States rank as the world's biggest current greenhouse gas emitters. Do you trust China to make meaningful change, especially given what we've seen in the last few years? Or, and what would you like China to do next to help tackle this problem, given their outsized impact on what's happening and what enters the atmosphere?
China is, I don't think we're in a position to trust China, but as soon as acting on climate is clearly in their self-economic interest, I think they will act very quickly, probably quicker than, a messy democracy like the United States is able to move. But if we lead and we make the economics of all of this work for the rest of the world, even recalcitrant countries like China will act in their own economic interest.
Even at a time, just to follow up on that, obviously they really, are continuing to build coal plants, and especially in the last year or so, we haven't seen, they've actually moved, quite quickly on EVs, but haven't moved as quickly in other areas. But you anticipate that they'll shift just going forward, given their own self-interest?
I think the economics, if we build successful economics for both generation in particular, as well as for things like transportation, the industrial sector, other countries, all countries really will follow once the economics are in their interest. And we're creating, a model for that in the United States. So I think it's very positive that the U.S. and China are talking again. If you look at their behavior on climate, it is not something that is consistent across the board. As you mentioned, they're moving very fast on EVs. And I think we have a responsibility to make sure that we own a substantial portion of the EV supply chain and the battery supply chain here in the United States to be able to compete with China. But they're also going to realize that if we have the cheapest power on the planet, then maybe building coal plants doesn't make sense, and they should actually be investing more in renewables.
And very quickly, we're almost out of time, but a bill you introduced, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, is awaiting Senate approval. And the editorial board here at the Post called it the most significant conservation law in decades. Are you confident it'll pass by year's end, and why?
We are working very hard to secure the passage of that legislation. And I am optimistic, but the end of any congressional session is always filled with some level of uncertainty. So, this is a bill that would be a game changer for wildlife in the United States at a time when we all recognize there is an enormous wildlife and biodiversity crisis in the planet. So the fact that we've secured so much bipartisan support for this legislation gives me optimism.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we'll have to leave it there. Senator Heinrich, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll be